для вас, щоб можна було так більш-менш неформально поспілкуватися. Девід працював в часи Холодної війни в Москві як кореспондент і Financial Times, пізніше The Wall Street Journal. Писав для інших видань, застав період і перебудови і розпаду Радянського Союзу, і потім, вже більше як науковець, але також як і публіцист, писав для основних американських видань на тематику, пов'язану з розпадом Радянського Союзу, після пострадянської Росії, криміналізацією влади. І ми його запросили якраз поговорити, чи війна і події, які розвивалися останнім часом, це є таким наслідком довгого процесу, а не лише рішенням Путіна, там, ну, що це не щось таке швидке, що це напрацьовувалося десятиріччями. Тож передаю слово Девіду. Девід розуміє російську, знає російську, наскільки я читав, часто це використовував при КГБ.
Are you KGB agent?
No.
Okay,
No.
so the floor is yours.
In fact, I have a story which about my first encounter with the KGB. It was when I was young, or I was younger than you. Well, no, yeah, maybe the same age. When I first went to the Soviet Union as correspondent for the Financial Times. And I went to the Baltic republics to learn about the dissident movement. And I met 3 KGB agents who pretended to be dissidents. You know, and I was young and very naive. I spent 3 days with people I thought were dissidents, only to learn later that they were really KGB agents. But then, well, to make a long story short, I found the original dissidents and I got the information and I wrote about the dissident movement in Lithuania at that time. And it was published in the Financial Times, and then the BBC Russian service and Lithuanian service broadcasted, and Radio Liberty, they broadcasted back, and it was the first time that the existence of the Lithuanian dissident movement was publicized. Anyway, so I told this, I wrote about this, how I spent time with the KGB, who pretended to be dissidents, and I called the article, How I Outsmarted the KGB. So anyway, no, I'm not a KGB agent, but I lived for many years in Moscow. And I traveled frequently to Ukraine, including to Donetsk, and to Lviv, Kyiv, of course, and for some reason, almost all of the people that I met who tried to escape from the Soviet Union, either by swimming across the Black Sea, crossing overland into Persia or Turkey, or crossing overland into Finland. For some reason, in those years, they were almost all Ukrainians. I don't know why, but that was an interesting fact. And my experience with the KGB was echoed by the experience of one person who told his story to a friend of mine. He was in the prison in Batumi, and he had tried to cross the border into Turkey, I think it was. Or maybe it was into Iran, and he was just in that prison. But he told the story, and then this guy, who was also arrested in the border zone, told the story to me about how he had, you know, in the old days in the Soviet Union, they had this zone next to the border where if you didn't have special permission, you could be arrested for being there, even if you were a normal Soviet citizen. And he said he spent 3 days at night hiding in the woods, crawling through the woods to get to the border, so and praying that no one would see him. And then finally he saw, you know, the border posts of the Soviet Union, and I guess it was Turkey or Iran. And he got up, ran out, ran to the first house he saw on the other side of the border, and asked them to call the American embassy. And they said, of course, just wait here, we'll call you. And you know, the KGB arrived and grabbed him, arrested him. He said, you can't arrest me, I crossed the border. He said, this is the false border. The real border is, you know. So they had created a fictitious border. And I met fictitious dissidents. And the whole country was a fictitious country. So when a country like that breaks up, what can you expect? It's a lot of chaos. Anyway, I want to just talk to you. I'll tell you briefly what I think is the reason for the war and why we are in the situation that we are now. And then we can discuss. I think we'll just leave maximum amount of time for you to ask your questions. The Soviet Union, as you know, or as you've heard, was based on the idea of class values. Not, there were Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, they all reject, you know, the Bolsheviks, they rejected the idea of a universal standard of right and wrong. Right was defined, and this was, Lenin made this very clear in his speech to Komsomol in 1919. He said, if you want to know, you know, people accuse us of having no morality. That's not true. We have a higher morality. Our morality consists of the morality of the revolution. Whatever is in the interests of the revolution is right. Whatever gets in the way of the revolution is wrong. Well, needless to say, this is nothing but a justification of total power and a formula for destroying morality. But that became the ruling ethic of the Soviet Union, every part of it, in Russia, Ukraine, everywhere else where communist power was installed. And that did tremendous damage to people. It did damage most of all to Russia, because Russia was the country which imposed it on the rest of the empire that it assembled, including, of course, Ukraine. And arguably, Ukraine suffered more than any other part of the Soviet Empire from the fact that it was part of that empire. But it had a particular effect, and I watched this effect over time on those particularly who sought power. And I saw this in Yeltsin, I saw it in Putin, which was simply to destroy the roots of conscience. The formula replaced any type of autonomous moral judgment, and the aspiration to power justified everything. And I think that is the best way of explaining how Putin came to power in 1999 and 2000. We may not remember it, but at the time, I mean, no one had ever heard of Putin. He was completely unknown. Yeltsin, okay, Yeltsin was a public political figure. He was a public politician. He had many negative qualities, but he did have the capacity to go out, meet people, and win support. Putin had none of that at the time. He and Yeltsin, by his own description, chose Putin after considering 22 other candidates. But what he what he did have was a readiness to commit absolutely any crime in order to protect Yeltsin's corrupt family. At the time in Moscow, I don't know if you, I was in Moscow in the summer of 1999. I don't know how many of you remember this, but there was an atmosphere that's, you know, something is going to happen. Yeltsin's second term is running out. His family is totally corrupt. The opposition wants to put them in jail. There are rumors everywhere that Yeltsin will declare martial law, or he will find a way of choosing a successor who will make sure that he's not prosecuted. I had a conversation with someone I knew very well there and who was very well connected. He said, Yeltsin is ready to blow up half of Moscow in order to protect his corrupt family. And then shortly afterward, the buildings in Russia began to be blown up in the middle of the night. In the end, there were 4 buildings that were blown up. 300 people were killed, and they died while they, you know, because the explosions were timed to go off at 5 in the morning so that the largest number of people would be home and asleep and helpless, and that's what happened. And all of this created the hysteria that was necessary. The Russian population was not in favor of a second war in Chechnya. But after the apartment bombings, which were blamed on the Chechens, their panic seized the country, and they supported a new war in Chechnya. That war elevated the previously, suddenly Putin was everywhere. A person who had been completely invisible now was inescapable. You couldn't turn on the television without seeing a picture of Putin surrounded by troops, issuing bloodthirsty threats, promising to avenge the innocent Russian people who were murdered as they slept. By whom? It's not clear. But they said it was the Chechens. And he began to rise in popularity from 2% to 10%, 15%, 20%, finally well over 30%, and it was clear he was going to win the election. And he did. He became the Russian president. And everything would have been fine, except that a bomb was discovered in the basement of a building in Ryazan, where you know where Ryazan is, outside of Moscow, southeast of Moscow. And it was diffused in time. And it was identical to the bombs that were used in the other 4 bombings. And they arrested 3 people who had put the bomb in the basement of the building. And they said, we've caught the Chechen terrorists. Except they weren't Chechen terrorists, they were FSB agents. Well, the episode was quickly forgotten because it was too inconvenient both for the Russian public and for, you know, completely hopeless Russian civil society, but also for hopeless American and Western society, which didn't have the will or the intelligence to draw the conclusions that were necessary. And as a result, a terrorist became the head of the Russian state. And in charge of the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. Could have been prevented. The U.S. Embassy had the information that this was a terrorist act, and they had the information that it was carried out by the FSB. They chose not to act on it.
Why is it chosen?
That's why they chose not to act on it. Of course, we can't question them. It was Madeleine Albright who made that decision. In fact, she refused to answer direct questions about it in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But I think there were 2 reasons. One, they couldn't imagine it. It just seemed too fantastic that they could be so cruel. Who would kill? You can understand someone who kills a political opponent, but who kills 300 of his own people, chosen at random for no reason at all except to gain power? And the other thing is that they had they devoted their careers to promoting Yeltsin as the symbol of democracy. And it was clear that if this had taken place, Yeltsin was probably involved. And they feared for their careers. In any case, they learned a lesson that terrorism works. Terrorism can be successful. And they also understood that hatred for the regime and the hatred for the Yeltsin regime was incredible. Only 2% of the population supported Yeltsin, according to a public opinion poll before the bombings. Well, sociologists will tell you that in any poll, 6% of the population doesn't understand the question. So that means that practically no one in Russia supported Yeltsin. And so the effect is obvious. Direct the hatred of the people away from the regime and toward an external enemy. In this case, it was the Chechens. 14 years later, it would be Ukraine. Because the Maidan revolt, which was, it took place, as you know, in December 2013 and then early part of 2014, was a direct threat to the Putin regime. They had succeeded in establishing control over all the levers of power. But there was one thing that they could not necessarily control, and that was a mass demonstration, self-organized, involving hundreds of thousands of people, on the model of what happened here. That was capable of overthrowing the kleptocratic regime, as it did in Ukraine, in Kyiv, during Euromaidan. And the only way to change the conversation was foreign aggression. And the result was the annexation of Crimea and, of course, the war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass. In other words, the playbook was absolutely the same. Distract the attention of the population from their real problems, direct it toward a foreign enemy. And of course, in the case of the seizure of Crimea, this played directly to the irredentist and revanchist sympathies and the imperial mentality of the country. If the country didn't have that mentality, this tactic would not work. Well, the result, of course, as we know, the seizure of Crimea sent Putin's popularity rating, which in 1999 was 2%, the same as Yeltsin's before the bombings, up to 88%. The effect of the seizure of Crimea on Russian public opinion was just phenomenal. There was euphoria in Russia. Russia is returning to greatness. Of course, it didn't show any such thing, but this was the impression. And that effect lasted for 5 years. And it began, it finally began to run out. And the lawlessness, the corruption, the lack of political choice, the degradation of day-to-day life in Russia began to be felt. The desire of hundreds of thousands to emigrate. All of this created the conditions for a new provocation. in 2021, the United States abandoned Afghanistan. Now, you may remember that Ukraine was requesting most valued ally status. There's a certain term which I'm not remembering exactly, but we have a special term in the United States for our closest allies outside of NATO. And that term was used, I think it's most valued ally or closest ally.
Like Israel?
What was, not most favored, was it most favored ally? Anyway, we'll find, that's less important than the fact. And that was the status that Afghanistan had. And we, of course, completely abandoned Afghanistan. And we had no need to. So this was all that I think was necessary to persuade Putin that he could attack Ukraine, and the West would not support Ukraine, and that there would be no serious consequences, and that after he had taken Kyiv in 3 days, replaced the government with a pro-Russian government, put down any resistance that might have existed in the country, in his view. Russia would have a new claim to greatness in his terms. His popularity would return to the levels that it achieved after the seizure of Ukraine. And the West would make some ritual complaints and then go back to business as usual. Well, yes?
I wanted to ask, do you think Western government could expect this scenario of Russia?
I'm sorry, what?
Could Western government expect actually this scenario of Russia? Could predict that they're going to attack us in this way?
Yeah, they definitely did. We know that. We know that was the plan. This is well documented. That
so they knew that after leaving Afghanistan, Russia could probably attack us again fully.
After the resistance, did they think there would be no partisan warfare,
yes,
no internal resistance? We don't know everything about what's going on in their crazy minds, but the one thing is that, and I've made this point before in other audiences, Russia always underestimates resistance. They thought that they could, when they started the first Chechen war, Pavel Grachev, who was the Minister of Defense, said that I can end resistance in Grozny in 2 hours with one paratroop regiment. Well, didn't turn out that way. And in fact, Russia has been predicting easy victories in virtually every war it's fought since the Russo-Japanese War. And they've frequently been surprised and disappointed by the resistance, as they were in Ukraine. In addition to being aggressive, they don't think straight. And they always underestimate their enemies, which is, unfortunately, a mistake that the United States sometimes makes. But not to the same extreme. So where does that leave us now? They are locked in a war they cannot win. They are losing fantastic numbers of people, but they are causing Ukraine also to lose terrible numbers of people. And they are throwing in, as I was just told in a recent seminar, a point that was very interesting, that the Russians are losing in many cases convicts and criminals, whereas Ukrainians are sacrificing some of their best people in this war. And they're likely not to be able to deal with highly professional Ukrainian army, which is now going to be armed with the latest Western weapons, and I'm sure the F-16s as well. But they are sufficiently barbaric to attack infrastructure and use tactical nuclear weapons. There's no moral barrier to that, which there would be in any reasonable leadership of a government. So we have to hope, I think, for a rapid victory, for maximum deterrence and a strong stand on the part of the United States and the West. I personally am involved in this a little bit and trying to do what I can. And we have to spread the awareness in the West, and I have to say that President Zelensky has done, in my view, a good job of doing this, that this is a fight not just for one country, but it reflects, the will of the world not to allow a criminal regime to start dictating terms to everybody else, which is the last thing that kind of dignified people want. Now, that's a very brief kind of discussion of how we got into all this. So, but why don't you try to answer your questions? And
sorry, maybe for my not good English, but if we all know that Russia can use tactical nuclear weapon, why West world cannot use the same weapon to Ukraine if Russia will use it after it?
Well, I think that if there's a use, I mean, there have been various, I'm not an expert on this, but the people who are experts tell me that there are many plans being, first of all, the United States cannot allow Russia to use nuclear weapons against a country that gave up its nuclear weapons and then win as a result. Yeah. Because this will create total chaos in the world for the United States. So it's absolutely certain that if those weapons are used, there will be the kind of
give us back the same what we give to you.
Well, it sounds easy to do that, but even transferring nuclear weapons is a technical process. Mm-hmm. And by the way, preparing for a nuclear strike is a technical process involving a lot of people, and we can watch it. We will know if those, so far no, we will see the signs that such a thing is being contemplated. So I can't say what they would do if they see that that's underway, but it's beyond what can be tolerated. I can tell you that. I mean, whether it would be nuclear response, whether it would be non-nuclear, how it would work, there are still a lot of things. We've seen the power of Western weapons. We know that there are a lot of things that can be done. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this morning, last night in America, Lindsey Graham and Dick Blumenthal put forward a Senate resolution saying that a Zaporizhzhia accident or a tactical nuclear weapon would be considered to be triggering Article 5 of NATO.
Both seem to be triggering
the Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So that's one response which may be coming into.
But I wonder how they back that reasoning, since Ukraine is not a member of NATO.
No, but radiation would pass into.
Oh, if the radiation reaches the in that case. Possibly, yeah. Contamination of the neighboring countries, certainly.
And that even if the wind doesn't go that way, creating that risk is an attack on Poland or Romania or whatever.
In other words, even simply creating such a risk for Poland and Romania. Yeah, well, if they have the will to react that way, we're getting into in the area of military strategy is I think that at the present time the Russians believe that they can outbleed the Ukrainians, and that they can hold on even to what they have taken. That they have a greater capacity to lose lives. First of all, they don't care about the lives of their own people, and that if it's a competition, who can suffer the most, that they can suffer more than anyone else. So it will, now, people who are knowledgeable see a lot of possibilities for the Ukrainian armed forces. And remember, Russians now are committed to a static defense. And a static defense means you can't move very easily. Any breakthrough, if there's a real breakthrough, could really lead to a collapse of the front, just as it did in the Second World War, when the Maginot Line, which was considered impregnable, was breached and then overwhelmed by the Nazis. So we don't know, but the Ukrainian armed forces have done very, very well. But we only know that they have to be supported. What tactics they use, what the reactions will be, it's hard to predict. In the case of the Russians, we know that unfortunately the worst is possible. The real issue here is, will this threaten Putin and his group themselves? Then they are capable of stopping the war and withdrawing their troops, and presenting it as a great victory, if in fact that's necessary in order to save themselves. We saw an example of that during the first Chechen War, when after 16 months or 18 months of bloody fighting, Yeltsin not only removed all Russian troops from Chechnya, but did it ahead of time, because once he was told that he would lose his campaign for re-election if the war was still going on. And I don't think that Putin in that respect is any different. If it's necessary to hold on to power, just because he doesn't care about the lives of his own people or the lives of Ukrainians, it doesn't mean that he doesn't care about his own life. In fact, he probably cares about it more than anything else. And so that's what we have to deal with. That's what we have to have in our calculations. Yes?
Yeah, we're actually talking about like Putin and his group or so. Do you believe that Russian population also generally responsible for this war? Because they also make these decisions, like not to do anything.
They're responsible, but they're also, I mean, they're responsible, but they're also victims of propaganda. They choose to be victims to some extent, but and you see, Russia is a very specific country. As we know, Russia's in a way it's less a country than a movement.
This is not a country. This is jail.
Well, let's put it this way: in a movement, individual counts for nothing. The only thing that counts.
But they like them from.
Well, this is how the psychology of the nation was shaped over, not over months, and not over years, but over centuries. And the idea that Russia's messianic country. It's a country that thinks it has a great mission. And it thought, you know, Russians thought of their great mission to save the world. They're always saving someone. That they have, they had the truest form of Christianity was, of course, Russian Christianity, Russian Orthodoxy. And on behalf of this truest form of Christianity, exemplified in the world's greatest ruler, the Russian Tsar, the Russian people were united in their slavery, in their bid to spread the blessings of Russian rule everywhere. And then when the communists took over, it seemed as if, you know, everything had changed. The old regime had been destroyed. There were new rulers. They had, you know, those who were at the bottom were suddenly at the top. Those who were at the top fell to the bottom. But the psychology was the same. They were going to extend the blessings of communism to the whole world. And one of the most important factors in breaking that psychology is military defeat. After the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, Russia, for the first time in its history, got a constitution. After the defeat in the Crimean War, the slaves were, serfdom was abolished. After the defeat in the Cold War, in effect, communism fell. What will happen after the defeat in the war with Ukraine? Hard to say, but it could be the beginning of the psychological liberation of Russia. Because it's not true that, from my observations, that everyone in Russia shares this mentality. I would say that, by my estimates, and just based on many years of experience, I'd say that 10 to 15% of the population are normal people who think normally. That seems to be a small percentage, but under certain circumstances, their influence can increase. Because we saw that during perestroika, under Gorbachev, when the Russian population was exposed to truthful information, the ideas that had once been held by a very small minority suddenly became dominant for the majority of the population. It didn't last for a long time, but it was. Anyone else have any thoughts? Yeah.
Yes, I want to ask you about past, not future or present. You were born in Illinois, in Chicago.
Yeah, in Chicago.
Grew up in the US and got education in the US. After you came to Soviet Union, first born, were you surprised by the mental of Soviet person?
By the what?
Were you surprised?
Was I surprised by Soviet people?
No, by
oh,
Soviet
yeah.
people. Second one, which difference was between American and Soviet people, and was there anything you could not understand there in Soviet?
About it. Okay, that's a really good question, actually. Yeah, they were different because I remember. I'll tell you a story. American people, We have some Americans here, so they're going to be offended maybe. But American people are very practical. You know, they think about, you know, practical things like money and property and success and having a good time and that kind of thing, and, you know, and enjoying life. And
It looks like you are normal people.
what?
It looks like that Americans are normal people.
But our Russians or Soviet people, they don't have any of these things. They don't have any of this opportunity. They want to save the world. And they live in a world of their imagination. So one of the things that was always very interesting is you would travel in the Soviet Union and you were an American and you're an American correspondent. The first thing you found was that Soviet citizens loved to engage you in political discussion. So I remember I was on a train and there was a couple of people in the compartment and I actually didn't want to participate in this, but I had no choice. And they said that, you know, how can you live in such an unjust system in the U.S.? And I said, well, you know, why is it unjust? He said, well, you know, in your country, you know, the rich rule everything. The Rockefellers are the real rulers. I said, well, he said, hey, money determines everything. I said, well, listen, you know, we have elections, we can choose our leaders. And he said, what you have in America is formal democracy. What we have in this country is genuine democracy. Formal democracy. I said, well, are you saying that when you have two candidates, it's formal democracy? And when there's only one candidate, it's genuine democracy. And they looked at me as if, you know, it's practically an imbecile had finally understood some basic realities. And I thought, you know, really, that this country is a big insane asylum. It's, you know, I had encounters like that all the time. I mean, it was just a giant theater of the absurd in which people would act out, you know, their ideological roles. And to some extent, they're still acting. Communism turned the Soviet Union into a nation of actors because you had to pretend to believe the ideology. And that residue in Russia, that lives on, and we see it now with on the propaganda broadcasts. Many of those people on Russian propaganda TV are people I know, because in the 1990s, many of them received American grants. Dmitry Kiselyov, one of the...
You teach them.
What?
Yeah, America teaches these people.
Well, I don't know what they taught them, but this is how we waste our money. But we thought we were teaching them democracy. What we really were teaching them was how to pretend to be democratic. But Dmitry, he was, you know, pro-American, pro-Western. By the way, so was Dmitry Medvedev. But they have no will. You know, dictatorship destroyed their will and left, you know, people who will do anything for power, and that's what we had. So I gradually became accustomed to living in this unreal world, and I understood that it was very difficult to explain it to Americans because they could not accept the idea that a nation is created specifically around to give a false impression of itself. Mm-hmm. But that's the reality. That's the reality. Now you asked so the difference between, and I think your final question was, did I come to understand it? Well,
Yeah, could not understand.
did I understand it or not?
No.
What you couldn't understand.
What could I not understand?
Was anything you could not understand?
Yeah. You know, you can understand everything if you make an effort. If you make, I mean, most Americans are not willing to make that effort. Just take the question of the bombing of the buildings, how Putin came to power. I've been trying to explain to the world for literally 23 years how Putin came to power. And it is very hard for America, and the evidence is incontrovertible and overwhelming. All you have to do is look at it. But the refusal to look at it is hard to overcome. But if you want to know the truth, and you're willing to, to understand Russia, you have to understand one thing. You have to understand that the impossible is really possible. Once you understand that the unbelievable is really believable, then everything that happens in Russia makes perfect sense. And but that's to ask Americans to do that is very difficult.
Why Americans don't use sanction after occupation of Georgia in 2008? Why they don't start doing this?
Just stupidity really, because I remember, and after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, and the murder of Anna Politkovskaya in 2006, Michael McFaul, who became the American ambassador, I know him very well. Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered, he and I had a talk with Michael before the Obama administration. And we tried to explain to him that Putin was dangerous, that he had to be controlled, that he was not a potential partner. But Michael, of course, was thinking of his career, as practically all our people do, and he understood that the only thing that President Obama wanted to hear was that all the faults, all the trouble in the world was the fault of George Bush and no one else. As for Putin, he was just misunderstood. And of course, listen, just as Dmitry Medvedev does what advances his career, so our people do what advances their careers. And it's hard, it's hard to tell an American president, particularly one like Obama who considers he knows everything, that there's some things he doesn't know. He doesn't have time for it. He's thinking about completely different things. To sit down and try to understand that there's one country, Russia, which has a psychology different from anybody else, that's more work than he wants to do. But we see the results. And a couple of weeks after our conversation with Michael, he announces the reset policy, so-called reset, Perezagruzka in Russian. And then he begins to call himself the father of the reset. Now, of course, he's pretending to be that he never said anything like that, or he doesn't advertise it. But it's too late, of course.
But they know that they killed 300 people in the building to become...
They don't want to think about it. They just, it's too, I mean, they would have to start thinking at a different level. And they want to think at a shallow level. And they will, and this is some of a human characteristics, rather than operate outside, to acknowledge there are things they don't know, to be truly open-minded, to truly try to understand. The number of people like that Very few. And very few in government, especially those trying to make their careers in our system. Yeah.
We need to expect more big crisis situation if American politics will do like that in the next period.
Well, we're going to do. I mean, I'll do from on my part, and other people I think are at least have the wit to understand that Ukraine needs to be supported. Will do what they can, and we hope somehow that Biden performed much better than I expected. We can criticize him, but still. The U.S. has done much better than one could have hoped, and I hope it will do even better. And and even in the case of Trump, it's important to bear in mind if he's reelected as president.
Is it real?
What?
Is it real that Trump can be president?
You tell me.
I don't know Americans.
You don't have to. You just have to have common sense.
Are you Democrat or Republican?
What?
Are you Democrat or Republican?
That's an interesting question. I wrote my when I was a graduate student, I wrote a thesis on Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. Well, there was one point where someone stopped her in an interview and asked her if she was Democrat or Republican. And she started scratching her head, she couldn't figure it out. I can't figure it out either. Actually I don't like either of them, but I guess it's the lesser of two evils. And I like certain people sometimes if they say the right things.
But you vote.
What?
But you vote.
I vote. And I think I'll vote again. But my contribution is to all this is not just voting, but trying to talk to people like you. And,
we need you talk to Americans, not only to us. And tell them truth.
Do you talk to Americans? Talk to Ukrainians? I even talk to Russians because I'm interviewed on Radio Liberty all the time, and I speak in Russian. I'm not speaking Russian now because I know you all speak English, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody who doesn't speak English? Here? Anybody else have any questions?
Do you feel that the Biden administration, the decision pushed by the UK decisions? Because UK
they were
more aggressive decisions or more
possibly. UK has
not want to lose this fight with the UK, which US always has.
There's very close relationship between UK and US. Always.
Big struggle between them.
Struggle, but I mean the influence of British, they have influence. What they do has influence in the U.S. And the UK is one country that the U.S. will listen to. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily do it, but maybe more than any other country. I think it did have maybe some influence.
Because it feels like the US.
I think the US is slower. UK is
the influence to the UK.
UK is parliamentary system. They can make decisions faster than once the prime minister is he has automatic majority. He doesn't have to fight for anything unless he loses. Of course, he can lose power. But a parliamentary system can act faster. Also, that's also a factor.
Do you believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is the best solution for long-term security, and maybe the shortest way.
Yeah, I'm not sure right now, because the problem is that, eventually as part of the settlement now, if it's NATO membership for what? What are we guaranteeing? Are we guaranteeing just the part of Ukraine that's not occupied? Well, that means that we're consenting to the occupation. So it's not so simple. But of course it's going to depend on security guarantees. And the will to weaken Russia by really cutting off the revenues from oil and gas, that's what can really make a difference. Now, one thing we talked about tactical nuclear weapons, but a total oil and gas embargo, that would be supported by countries outside of NATO, would probably follow Russian use of a nuclear weapon, because we aren't the only ones who don't want to see nuclear weapons used.
What about nuclear sanctions? About nuclear plants, what Russia is selling to all over the world? They built these nuclear plants and sell equipment for it. When the US will use sanctions to block this market for Russia?
The US is now, despite everything, still processing fuel in Russia. So I don't know. Those are complicated questions regarding nuclear technology. Why hasn't that been stopped? Don't know.
In Turkish, they use it.
What?
They built a nuclear plant in Turkey.
That's a NATO country. There are other steps that can be taken. I'm not an expert on the sanctions, but a friend of mine who was the Polish representative to the International Monetary Fund described a whole set of measures that have not been taken that could be. The reason they tend not to be is, of course, they strike against the American economy too, which, everything would change if there was the use of a nuclear weapon. And also there's the question of what exactly they could accomplish. It would not win the war for them. It would just cause a lot of suffering. Well, I think we're probably, are there any more questions, or I think we're drawing close to the end of our time here. If you have one or two more questions, I can answer them.
Maybe final question.
Coming back to Trump, if by any chance he will be back to the office, do you think he will change the support from the US, or he will not do it?
It's not sure. Not sure that he would. It's not sure that he would, because Trump, he understands what it means to be bullied, because he's been bullying people all his life. And I think he will try it. I don't want to idealize the guy, and he's not someone, who is worthy of idealization. But the one thing I think he's sincere about is that he cares about the security of the United States. And I think he can be made to understand that this war is necessary for Ukraine, and that it's necessary for the U.S., and it's necessary to win. So that's my hope. But of course, we have a lot of obnoxious people in the U.S. And the reason is that, a lot, but I don't know, maybe there are obnoxious people in other countries too. But who, because of democratic system, because of the internet, because of the fact that people who maybe, how to put this? Well, you know, the First Amendment says that everyone has a right to speak. But it used to be the case that they could speak to their wives, their children, but no one else had to listen. Now, with the internet, you know, everyone, you know, anyone who can, you know, make an extreme statement has the ability to get an audience of sorts. And it's not good, but I'm hoping that the public sentiment, nonetheless, on the whole, that common sense will still be, you know, the strongest factor. There are people who think they, you know, especially on the question of Ukraine and Russia, they have no modesty at all, and even the officials have no modesty, and they don't want to make the effort to learn. But I think the common sense arguments are strong, and they will ultimately, you know, prevail. Okay, I think with that, unless anyone else has anything else they want to ask me. If not, thank you for coming, all of you. I'm glad to meet you. I wish you all good luck. And working for the country's future, I'm sure you all will. And I may be back because we're I don't know if you know Leoніду Фінбергу. Do you know him? He is publishing some of my books in Ukrainian. Some are they already exist in Ukrainian, but he's publishing the others. So that will bring me back to Ukraine. Maybe I'll see you again. But anyway, nice to meet you and good luck. All right, take care. Yeah.
It's a book about hidden gems.
Oh, you
We learned stories about not
Oh, did we get out? Okay, we're going to get out. Come on. All those guys. How many? But you're going to have to give me a copy of this. Yeah.